Tasha Williams stood in the middle of her kitchen, looking at the mess of toys scattered across the floor as she hurriedly prepared dinner for her two children, her heart racing with anxiety over the upcoming school event she had promised to attend that evening, the weight of her day pressing on her shoulders as she wondered when she would find time to do everything she had to do. The house felt smaller with each passing hour, her thoughts constantly drifting to her husband Derek, who was busy with town business. As the mayor of their small town, Derek had always been the one in the spotlight while Tasha quietly took care of the home front. But tonight, something felt different. She couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. The sudden loud knock on the door broke through her thoughts, a sharp sound that made her jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the disturbance, perhaps a neighbor or a delivery. But when she opened the door, her stomach sank. There stood two uniformed police officers, their faces hard and stern, their presence filling the doorway like an ominous storm cloud. "Tasha, what's going on?" one of them asked in a tone that immediately set her on edge. "What do you mean, what's going on?" she replied, feeling a sudden tightness in her chest, her hand instinctively reaching for the doorframe as though it might offer her some stability. "We need to ask you a few questions," they said as one of the officers stepped forward, pulling out a set of papers from his jacket. The other officer moved closer as if to block any chance of escape. Tasha's mind raced and her heart thudded painfully in her chest. What was this about? Why was she being questioned? She glanced over her shoulder toward her children in the living room, hoping they hadn't seen the officers yet. The officer held up a piece of paper and began reading off a list of charges that sounded like they came from someone else's life, not hers. Tasha's knees went weak as she heard the words drug trafficking and conspiracy. It felt like the ground was slipping from beneath her. "But I don't understand," she stammered. "This is a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong." The officers exchanged a glance, neither offering an explanation. Instead, they informed her that she was under arrest and that they had a warrant for her immediate detention. Tasha's world tilted. She couldn't breathe as her mind struggled to catch up with the words she had just heard. Without waiting for her to protest, the officers stepped into her home, one of them cuffing her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. As she was escorted out the door, everything was happening too fast. She barely registered the distant cries of her children, who had now appeared in the doorway, her son looking at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Mommy, what's happening?" her daughter asked, voice trembling. Tasha's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but her voice was gone. There was no answer that would make sense, no explanation that would undo the shock of this moment. As they loaded her into the police car, she caught a glimpse of the streets of her town. Everything looked so normal, and yet everything was so wrong. The world outside hadn't changed, but hers had, and in that moment, she realized she was no longer just Tasha, the mother and wife. She was now someone they had decided was guilty long before the trial even began. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Tasha Williams sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly together as she tried to steady her nerves. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man named Charles Matthews, shuffled through his papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. Tasha could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the whispers that traveled through the room. Some were sympathetic, while others looked at her with judgment, as though she were already guilty. It was a town divided, and Tasha could feel that division pressing in on her from all sides. Judge Raymond Cole, a man whose stern face and cold demeanor seemed to reflect the harshness of the justice system itself, sat elevated at the bench, his gavel resting at his side. He had presided over countless trials, his reputation for delivering swift, unyielding sentences well known in the community. Tasha had heard the rumors about him, that he had little patience for defendants like her, that he often handed down harsh sentences without a second thought. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that the law would be fair and unbiased. But as she sat there, she felt a growing sense of dread that this trial would be nothing more than a formality. The prosecutor, a sharp and well-spoken woman named Allison Reed, stood at the front of the room, presenting the case with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome before it even began. She painted a picture of Tasha as a mastermind behind a drug trafficking ring, using her position as a stay-at-home mother to hide the illicit operations. The evidence, though circumstantial, seemed damning. A bag of drugs found in her car, a few text messages that could be interpreted as incriminating, and a series of questionable connections to people with criminal records. Tasha's stomach churned as the prosecutor detailed each piece of the case, twisting the facts into a narrative that felt alien to her life. Tasha glanced over at her lawyer, who was preparing his defense. He had assured her that he would prove her innocence, that he would show the court that the evidence against her was flimsy and unreliable. But even as he spoke, his words seemed to have little effect on the judge, whose expression remained unchanged. It was as if Judge Cole had already made up his mind before the trial had even begun. As the hours dragged on, Tasha felt herself slipping deeper into a state of disbelief. The courtroom was a cold, indifferent place, where truth seemed secondary to preconceived notions. It was becoming clear that her race, her background, and her gender were all working against her. The jury, a group of mostly white men and women, didn't seem to question the narrative that had been presented to them. There was no room for doubt in their minds, no consideration for the possibility that Tasha might be innocent. When the time came for Tasha to testify in her defense, her voice faltered. She tried to explain her side of the story, to tell them that she had been framed, that the evidence was planted, but her words felt hollow, lost in the sea of accusations. The judge barely looked at her as she spoke, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him as if he were already preparing his verdict. Tasha's heart raced as she saw the doubt in the eyes of the jury. She knew that the truth didn't matter here. This wasn't about justice. It was about power, prejudice, and the illusion of fairness. The room felt suffocating, and Tasha realized that the trial was not a quest for truth, but a performance, one where her fate had already been decided. The day the verdict was read, everything in the courtroom seemed to slow down, as though time itself was holding its breath. Tasha sat rigidly in her chair, her hands cold and clammy, despite the oppressive heat in the room. Her lawyer, Charles Matthews, sat beside her, his expression unreadable. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, the thud of it almost drowning out the murmurs of the crowd behind her. The jury had deliberated for hours, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. Judge Raymond Cole's voice rang out, cutting through the heavy silence. He was calm, almost detached as he looked at the jury and then at Tasha. His eyes were cold, unreadable. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, the weight of the moment seemingly lost on him as he prepared to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Tasha Williams, guilty of drug trafficking and conspiracy," he announced, his voice echoing in the sterile courtroom. Tasha's breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, the room seemed to spin. She had prepared herself for the worst, but hearing the words confirmed her worst fears. The air seemed to thicken around her, and for a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't even think. The weight of the sentence was suffocating. Life in prison. She couldn't believe it. This wasn't just a sentence. It was a lifetime stripped away in an instant. Tasha's eyes darted to the people in the courtroom. Her heart ached as she saw her two children, sitting with her mother in the front row. They were too young to fully understand, but their faces were twisted with confusion and fear. Her son's small face was pale, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Her daughter clutched her grandmother's hand tightly, her face streaked with silent tears. The thought of being separated from them forever hit Tasha like a physical blow. Her chest tightened, and she had to fight to keep her composure, even as the tears threatened to spill. Charles Matthews, who had been her steadfast advocate throughout the trial, turned to her with a grim expression. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. There was nothing he could say to undo what had just happened. Nothing could change the fact that Tasha was now, in the eyes of the law, a criminal. Judge Cole continued, his voice devoid of empathy, as he detailed the sentence. "You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole," he declared, his tone as flat as ever. "May you reflect on the choices you've made during the course of your sentence." The words echoed in Tasha's ears, each syllable like a hammer striking her spirit. Life without parole. The finality of it was almost too much to bear. There would be no second chances, no opportunities to clear her name, no hope for the future. The years that had stretched out before her, of raising her children, of building a life with Derek, suddenly seemed as distant as a dream she would never wake from. As the bailiff moved to take her into custody, Tasha felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned and saw Derek standing there, his face pale and drawn. He had been quiet throughout the trial, standing in the back of the room, watching helplessly as his wife's fate unfolded. But now, as he met her gaze, his expression was one of pure anguish. Tasha wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but the words got stuck in her throat. She couldn't promise him anything. All she could do was give him one last, lingering look as the officers led her away. She heard the sound of her children's cries behind her, but she couldn't turn back. The courtroom doors slammed shut, and the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders. Derek remained standing there, his body frozen in place as the room slowly emptied. The battle for his wife's freedom was just beginning. But for now, all he could do was watch as the woman he loved was taken away, her life shattered by a system that had failed her. Derek stood motionless in the courtroom, the weight of his wife's conviction pressing down on him like an anchor. The voices around him blurred into indistinct murmurs, the bustling crowd filing out of the room as if nothing had happened, as if a mother of two hadn't just been sentenced to life in prison. His world had just been upended, and yet he felt paralyzed, unable to move. His wife, Tasha, was gone, and he couldn't understand how everything had gone so horribly wrong. It was hours before Derek could bring himself to leave the courthouse. His body moved on autopilot, his mind too stunned to process what had just transpired. He walked to his car, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. The air felt thick, suffocating, and yet he couldn't breathe. He was the mayor of this town, a man who had worked tirelessly to make it better, to build a future for his family, and now everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The thought of his children growing up without their mother gnawed at his insides. The car ride back to his house was long, each minute stretching into an eternity. His mind raced as he replayed the trial over and over again. How could it have happened? How could the judge, a man who had presided over this town for decades, so openly ignore the truth? Derek knew the system wasn't perfect, but he had never imagined that his own wife would fall victim to its cruelty. It was supposed to work for people like them, wasn't it? When Derek finally arrived home, the house felt empty despite the presence of his two young children. His son Malcolm was sitting on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal. His daughter Amina was quietly drawing on the table, her small hand moving carefully across the paper, but both were silent. Their innocent faces looked up at him, their expressions full of questions they didn't know how to ask. They didn't understand why their mother wasn't there, why she had been taken away. "Daddy, is Mommy coming home?" Amina asked, her voice trembling. Derek's heart cracked. He knelt down to her level, his hand resting gently on her head. "Mommy's going to be okay," he lied, even as his own heart doubted the words. "We're going to make sure she's okay." But deep down, Derek knew the truth. The road ahead was going to be long, and it was going to take everything he had to fight for his wife's freedom. The moment he stepped into his role as mayor, he had been taught to navigate the world of politics with careful precision, always a few steps ahead. But now, for the first time, Derek felt lost. His connections, his status, his influence, all of it felt like nothing in the face of the injustice that had been done to Tasha. The next morning, Derek went straight to his office at City Hall. He couldn't let this go. The systems in place, the corrupt web that had ensnared his wife, had to be exposed. He sat behind his desk, staring at the city seal on the wall. His political instincts kicked in. He couldn't just sit back and hope the truth would come out. If the town's legal system had failed his wife, it would fail others too. He had to act. Derek began reaching out to people, quietly at first, careful not to draw attention. He called in favors from trusted allies, asking for information, pulling on the strings that had once been used to propel his career. He had spent years building relationships, cultivating influence, but now that influence had a singular purpose: to uncover the truth and free Tasha. Little did Derek know that he was about to uncover something far darker than he had ever imagined. The true fight for Tasha's freedom was just beginning, and it would not be fought only in the courts but in the hidden corridors of power. Derek was stepping into a battle that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the town he had spent his life serving. Derek's search for answers began in the shadows. He couldn't afford to draw attention to his actions just yet. Every move had to be calculated. The last thing he wanted was for Judge Cole, or anyone else involved, to suspect that he was about to uncover a scandal that could unravel the town's entire legal system. So he started small, reaching out to people he trusted within his inner circle, quietly gathering information about the judge and his past decisions. At first, it seemed like a wild goose chase. Derek didn't know what he was looking for, only that something didn't feel right. Judge Cole had been a fixture in the community for decades, a man whose word was considered gospel by many. He had a reputation for being tough but fair. Yet, as Derek started digging deeper, he began to see troubling patterns that began to suggest something far more sinister. The first clue came from an old colleague of Derek's, a retired prosecutor named Samuel Walker. Samuel had been around long enough to know the skeletons that some people worked hard to keep hidden. Over coffee at a local diner, Samuel leaned in, his voice low, as he passed Derek a file of old court transcripts. "Take a look at this," Samuel said, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. Judge Cole, he's always had a thing for the tough on-crime narrative, but there's more to it. His rulings, the ones that don't make the headlines, they're different. Too many harsh sentences for people of color. Too many cases that didn't add up. Derek flipped through the pages, his stomach sinking with each case. He had heard rumors about the judge's racial bias, but seeing the proof laid out in front of him was another thing entirely. Judge Cole had a history of handing down disproportionately severe sentences to black defendants, often with little regard for mitigating circumstances. Derek's mind raced as he thought back to Tasha's trial, how the judge had barely acknowledged the defense's arguments and had seemed dismissive of any evidence that might suggest her innocence. The more Derek looked into it, the clearer it became. Judge Cole wasn't just a product of his time. He was actively using his position to manipulate the system, favoring certain individuals and businesses, while ruthlessly punishing others. Derek soon discovered that the judge had received large sums of money from local businesses with ties to criminal activities, money that seemed to appear just after certain rulings were made. The pieces were starting to come together, and Derek knew this wasn't just about one wrongful conviction. This was a system of corruption that reached far beyond his wife's case. He began to connect the dots. Cole had a network of supporters, people with money and power, who had been profiting from the judge's rulings for years. It wasn't just about race or bias, it was about control. Derek understood now that Tasha had been caught in a much larger scheme, one that involved people at the highest levels of the town's power structure. But Derek couldn't just confront Judge Cole. He needed evidence that would be undeniable, something that would force the town to take action. It was risky, but Derek had never been one to shy away from a challenge. If this fight was going to be won, it wasn't going to be through political power alone. He would need to expose the truth to the public to show everyone the extent of the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface for so long. The following days were a blur of meetings and phone calls. Derek met with investigative reporters who were eager to help expose the truth. He also contacted former colleagues in law enforcement, quietly gathering intel about Judge Cole's dealings. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope, knowing that any wrong move could jeopardize everything. As Derek dug deeper, he realized just how far-reaching this corruption was, and just how dangerous his pursuit of the truth could become. But there was no turning back now. Derek wasn't just fighting for his wife anymore. He was fighting for the future of his children, for the integrity of his town, and for a justice system that had to be held accountable. As Derek's investigation deepened, the walls around him seemed to close in. He had uncovered so much, too much, but still not enough to expose the full extent of the corruption in the town's legal system. The more he learned, the more he realized how intricately Judge Cole's influence stretched, not only within the courthouse, but also in local businesses, law enforcement, and even political circles. Derek had always known that power was wielded in shadowy corners, but never had he imagined the breadth of its reach. One evening, as Derek was going through a stack of documents in his office, he received a phone call that would change everything. It was from Detective Lisa Morgan, a trusted member of the local police force. Lisa had always been on Derek's side, a quiet ally who had never been afraid to speak up when something didn't sit right with her. Derek had worked with her in the past, and they had developed a professional, though distant, relationship. "Derek, we need to talk." Lisa's voice was tight, urgent. He straightened in his chair, his pulse quickening. "What's going on, Lisa?" "I've been looking into some things you've been asking about. I think I know who's behind all this, who's really pulling the strings, and I don't think you're going to like what I found." Derek's mind raced. He had been careful, always watching his back, but he hadn't expected someone from the inside to reach out to him, especially not someone from law enforcement. "What do you mean?" "Who?" Derek asked, his voice low. "I don't have much, but it's enough to start connecting the dots. The mayor's office, it's all linked." "I didn't want to believe it, but Cole isn't working alone. There's someone in your own office who's been playing both sides." Derek's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. He had trusted everyone around him, and yet now someone close to him was potentially involved in the corruption. "Who?" he demanded again, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and fear. Lisa hesitated, then spoke with quiet certainty. "Councilman Harold Finch. He's been getting too cozy with Cole over the years. It's not just politics anymore, it's money. Finch has been funneling funds into Cole's legal projects, and in return, Cole has been making sure Finch gets what he wants in the council meetings. I'm telling you, Derek, Finch is involved in this. He's as dirty as they come." The name hit Derek like a thunderclap. Harold Finch had been a longtime colleague, a man Derek had worked with closely during his tenure as mayor. Finch was a senior councilman, well respected in the town, and known for being deeply involved in many community initiatives. Derek had never suspected him. But now, with Lisa's revelation, the connections began to form in his mind. "Are you sure?" Derek's voice wavered, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. Unsure, Lisa replied, "I've been doing my own digging, and I've seen enough to know he's neck-deep in this. You have to be careful, Derek. Finch will deny it, but the truth is there if you look close enough. Just don't trust anyone." Derek sat back in his chair, the world around him spinning. Harold Finch, a man who had been his ally, had been part of the system that had taken Tasha from him. The magnitude of it was overwhelming, but even as anger swelled in his chest, Derek knew one thing for certain. He couldn't back down now, not when he was so close to the truth. The phone call ended abruptly, and Derek sat there, staring at the documents in front of him, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. He had to act quickly. Finch had to be exposed. The evidence he had gathered, though significant, still needed to be put together in a way that would force the public to see the corruption for what it was. But Derek knew one thing. He couldn't do it alone. He needed help. And if this fight was going to succeed, it would take every bit of the power and influence he had left. But Derek was willing to risk it all. His wife's freedom, his reputation, even his career, all of it was on the line. He was ready to fight, but he had to be careful. The battle was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. Derek felt like the walls were closing in faster than he could handle. The investigation was leading him into dangerous territory, and he knew the stakes had risen higher than he ever anticipated. If Harold Finch was indeed involved in the corruption surrounding Judge Cole, then not only was Tasha's fate on the line, but the entire town's justice system was at risk of collapsing under the weight of this conspiracy. And Derek had a choice to make. He could back away, protect his family, and preserve his career, or he could go all in and fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur of covert meetings, late-night research, and tense conversations. Derek had been in politics long enough to understand the delicate balance of power, but this was different. This wasn't about passing laws or securing votes. This was about exposing a deep-rooted web of corruption that had infected the town's very core. It wasn't just about his wife's wrongful conviction anymore. It was about a system that was built on lies and manipulation, and Derek couldn't sit back and let it continue. He decided to approach the issue from two angles. He needed to secure undeniable evidence that would expose Finch's involvement, and he had to start rallying support among the people of the town. He'd spent years cultivating relationships with local activists, reporters, and community leaders, and now was the time to call in those favors. Derek knew that if he could shine a light on Finch and Cole's dirty dealings, the public outcry would force the legal system to act. But he couldn't do it alone. Late one night, Derek met with a local investigative reporter, Sarah Wells. She had been covering corruption stories for years, but even she was shocked by the depth of what Derek had uncovered. Sarah's sharp instincts and access to resources would be crucial in piecing everything together. They sat in a small diner, tucked away in the corner, with the muted hum of conversations around them. "I didn't think this was possible," Sarah said, scanning the documents Derek had provided her. "You're telling me Finch has been paying off Cole to get favorable rulings? That's a bombshell, Derek." "I don't have enough to go public yet," Derek replied, his voice low. "But everything points to Finch. If we expose him, we'll show people that Tasha's case wasn't just an accident. It was part of a much bigger scheme." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing as she sifted through the evidence. "I'm in. But we need more than just documents. We need witnesses, people who've seen these transactions, people who know about the money flowing between Finch and Cole. This is going to take more than just us." Derek agreed. He knew that the truth wouldn't be enough unless it had the weight of undeniable proof behind it. But as he considered the next steps, something gnawed at him. Finch was a powerful man, and if he was indeed at the center of this conspiracy, he wouldn't go down without a fight. Derek could already feel the target on his back. If Finch or Cole found out what he was planning, his career, his family's safety, and even his own life could be in jeopardy. But he had no choice. He couldn't let Tasha suffer because of a corrupt system, and he couldn't let the people of his town remain ignorant to the truth. He owed it to the citizens of his town, to his children, and to his wife to expose the darkness that had been festering in their midst for so long. As the days passed, Derek became more determined. He worked tirelessly, carefully building a network of trusted allies who could help him gather the final pieces of the puzzle. He reached out to former colleagues in law enforcement and even some of the town's activists, asking them to watch for any signs of Finch and Cole's movements. The more Derek pushed, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran. And each new piece of information he uncovered brought him closer to the dangerous truth that could shatter everything. Derek was about to take a leap of faith, one that would force the people of his town to confront the ugly reality that had been hiding in plain sight. But he had to move quickly. Time was running out, and Tasha's future was hanging in the balance. The fight for justice was far from over, but Derek was prepared to fight with everything he had, even if it meant risking it all. The tension in the air was palpable as Derek prepared to make his final move. He had gathered everything he needed: the documents, the testimonies, the hard evidence. He knew that this was the moment where everything could change. There was no turning back now. He was about to expose Harold Finch's involvement in the corruption that had ensnared his wife and countless others. The fight for Tasha's freedom and for justice was reaching its crescendo. Derek met with Sarah Wells one last time before going public with the information. They sat in the same diner where they had first discussed the case, the weight of the moment hanging over them like a storm cloud. Sarah had worked tirelessly alongside him, cross-checking every detail, finding the missing pieces. She had interviewed key witnesses who had seen Finch and Cole together in compromising situations, their testimonies giving weight to the growing case. "I think we've got it," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We've got the story that will bring them down." Derek nodded, though his mind was racing. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Tasha, his children, and the future of his town. The truth had to come out, no matter what. But as Derek prepared to release the story to the press, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from Lisa Morgan, the detective who had been feeding him information. Her voice was strained, urgent. "Derek, you need to be careful," Lisa warned. I've been getting word from the inside. Finch knows someone's been digging into his past. He's not going to let this slide. You have to move quickly. The warning hit Derek like a bolt of lightning. He had suspected that Finch and Cole would fight back, but hearing it so plainly from someone inside the system made it all the more real. Derek couldn't afford to hesitate. The clock was ticking. He couldn't risk waiting any longer for more information, not when Tasha's future was at stake. With a deep breath, Derek made the decision. He called Sarah. It's time. We release the story now. The moment he hung up, Derek felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't relief or peace. It was the calm before the storm. He knew that once the story hit the press, it would set off a chain reaction that would shake the town to its core. He wasn't sure how much damage it would do, but he knew it would be worth it if it meant exposing the truth. The article, written by Sarah with Derek's information as the backbone, was published online that evening. The headline was bold, impossible to ignore. Asterisk corruption uncovered. Local mayors fight against judge and councilman's scandalous cheating asterisk. The fallout was immediate. The next morning, the news was everywhere. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon, national media began to take notice. The revelations about Judge Cole and Harold Finch's involvement in illegal dealings, backed by financial records, testimonies, and the undeniable proof of their collusion, became the focal point of the public. People took to social media in outrage, demanding accountability and justice. The town that Derek had once proudly served was now under a microscope, the secrets that had been hidden for years laid bare for the world to see. As Derek watched the news unfold on his television, his phone rang again. It was his attorney, who had been working behind the scenes to appeal Tasha's conviction. "Derek, we've got a hearing scheduled for this afternoon. We've got the support we need to reopen the case." Derek's heart skipped a beat. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. With the public outcry mounting, the legal system had no choice but to act. Derek was cautiously hopeful that Tasha's case could be overturned. The courtroom was packed that afternoon. Journalists, protesters, and concerned citizens filled the gallery as Derek stood beside his lawyer. On the other side of the room, Finch and Cole sat nervously, their once imposing presence now diminished by the weight of the truth. As the judge called the proceedings to order, Derek could sense the shift in the room. The power had tilted, and now the truth was on their side. After hours of hearings, the judge ruled in favor of reopening Tasha's case, citing the new evidence in the public outcry that had forced the system to take another look. Derek's breath caught in his throat as the judge declared that Tasha would be released pending a new trial. It wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the end for the corrupt system that had stolen so much from their family. As Derek stepped outside the courthouse, he saw Tasha waiting, her hands trembling as she held their children. For the first time in months, he could breathe easy. They had won the first round, but the fight wasn't over.